I think we can begin with the program. Are we all set? Hope so. Neera ma'am, welcome. We have another senior teacher from our college here.
Thank you so much, Swati, and it's a pleasure. Looking forward to the talk.
Welcome, ma'am. We're glad to have you on a off day. That is something to be grateful of. So, okay, good morning, everyone. The Department of English, College of Vocational Studies welcomes you all to the program today, which has been titled Decoding the popular within quotes. And we have two speakers with us. Our guest speakers are Dr. Anjana Neira and Ms. Sakshi Dogra, and both of us are from Gargi College. Um, so, Anjana ma'am had suggested that we, because in this popular fiction paper that we have, you know, so we have four different different genres, the four different categories, four different umbrella terms that we put together in the category of popular fiction. So to give just a connecting idea for those who obviously you must be aware of, different teachers must have already done that with you, and those who are not from the literature background here, even for those. So when we come to the category of popular fiction to begin with, so fiction is any imaginative piece of work which is in prose, and especially category of popular is has been into debates and scholarly debates, to be more precise, is because it has always been given a secondary treatment in literature. Sometimes, in fact, apart from popular fiction, everything else is considered literature. Even today, when we have award ceremonies, even if you go to the websites of different publishing houses, you will find these categories where there would be literary fiction and there would be popular fiction. So there is a bifurcation, there is a divide that the scholars and critics have maintained till date. So in our talk today, we will also talk about that, how much justified is this categorization and the secondary treatment that is meted out to popular fiction. So usually literary fiction, because against which popular fiction is juxtaposed, literary fiction is supposed to be something that is serious literature, something that is to be studied, something that is to be analyzed, which is canonical, and it is meant for a, a educated circle, people who have developed some taste, who have an understanding, who have literary acumen. And as opposed to that, popular fiction usually has a mass appeal, something that everybody can read. For that, you do not need to be highly intellectual. And because of that, there is a market orientation to popular fiction, that it is created for masses, it has a commercial base to it. So market or industry and entertainment, these are the two characteristics that usually get associated with the idea of popular fiction. We have different terms that we use, we have category fiction, genre fiction, pulp fiction, junk fiction, different terms that we use. And obviously, different scholars have also debated upon this bifurcation. So there is an idea that there is high cultural production. There are some literature that can be categorized into high cultural production, which constitutes of literary production, which are meant to be studied. And there are items that belong to the mass uh, cultural production, where popular fiction fits in, where it is meant for a market, which is meant for a general public, which usually reads them, which is something, these are the kind of books that you will read just once and merely for entertainment. These are not the books that are supposed to be studied or supposed to be analyzed, something that is supposed to give you an insight into, or give you a perspective, or an idea about some ideology. And therefore, some critics have also said that popular fiction creates a false consciousness, because most of the people, a mass, it has a mass appeal, And since the majority of the people can relate to it, it also reflects the ideology of the ruling class and creates a certain kind of hegemony. Similarly, we also have Christopher Pauling, who has denounced this idea of treating popular fiction as para literature. Para is something. Para is the meaning of para is like, that is, which is like literature but not literature. Something which has a secondary position when we talk of the hierarchies. So para literature. And he and Pauling argues that even if popular fiction is meant for a market, even if it has a mass appeal, we cannot say that there are no ideological contexts that are there in popular fiction. Even if we take detective fiction, if we take James Bond series, anything, they had allusions to the Cold War situation. If you have Bhimaina, for example, the graphic novel that we have, it in fact, a graphic novel, through the medium of graphic novel, which earlier was considered something just better than a comic, something not at all considered to be sophisticated or fit for a readership that is highly intellectual. But graphic novels have opened up a different array, have given a different mode, where especially those discourses that need visualization of the process, visualization of a history, for that graphic mode is very apt. Detective fiction, and you have a Murder of Roger Ackroyd. Detective fiction also, even though it brings to it, the main aim might have been to entertain the readers who just want to escape from the drudgery of life, or from the bourgeois, the working class stress and trials and tribulations of life that they go through. But even there, the characterization of the detective that we have, it is effeminate, someone who uses intuition, someone who uses domestic cues, as opposed to the pictures of James Bond or Sherlock Holmes, the white male racial patriarchal figures that we have. Lewis Carroll, looking through the looking glass, though considered children's literature, it is a critique of the Victorian society. And science fiction, it altogether brings to you, gives you a peep into the scope and the potential that, and the warnings that, scientific facts and arguments can provide to us. So everywhere we see that, we are the present, the modern, the contemporary scholarship is debating this bifurcation, this secondary treatment that have been given to popular fiction. And that is what we will also try to do, when our speakers enlighten us, that whether really, that the bifurcation that has been made into literature, that, one category belongs to art and another category belongs to commodity, which is popular fiction, how justified is this categorization at all? And does it serve any purpose? So we have our first, Anjana ma'am, would you go first? I hope so.
Good morning,
Okay.
students and colleagues. So thank you, Swati, for this opportunity to speak to your students and colleagues about my absolutely favorite genre for the classroom as well as for leisure, detective fiction. This is how I have planned my little presentation today. Detective fiction is not born out of nowhere without a context. So I thought it would be useful for us to begin by thinking about how this genre evolves. So a little bit about the history of the genre, because one of the characteristic features of popular literature is that I don't want to use the word process, but every popular literary text does have a background from which it draws. It may choose to carry forward that historical development. It may also choose to interrogate and subvert it. But in order to understand the tropes and the transgressions, which is what I have titled my paper, I think it would be important for us to begin with a very brief history of detective fiction in English. Let me clarify that because that's the boundary of my talk. The second thing I thought I will do is I will share with you some of the significant and, I must say, enduring tropes of detective fiction, because even contemporary detective fiction does tend to use the same tropes. They may use them differently, but they do tend to use the same ones. And then I'm going to end by spending a little bit of time talking about how we might read detective fiction. And when I'm talking about reading, and I am taking off from what Swati very eloquently described in her wonderful summing up of popular literature, I do want to reiterate that let it never be told to you that your enjoyment is to be reduced in order for your intellectual engagement to increase. Please enjoy what you are reading primarily. Once you enjoy it, I think if you have some interesting and useful critical tools, that enjoyment gets enhanced, right? So let's keep popular literature as something that is intensely enjoyable. But let's try and see whether we can make that enjoyment even more than it has been for us earlier. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm turning off my camera. I'm going to share my screen. And as soon as Swati confirms to me that it's visible, I'll begin. Could you confirm that that's visible, please, Swati?
Yes, ma'am, it's
All
visible.
right.
Can
So
the size be increased, ma'am? The size.
I'm on full screen.
Okay. Okay.
I don't know how to do anything beyond that.
I'm on a laptop, so it's fine for me. I hope people who are on their phones, it should work for them too.
Yeah. Maybe a couple of students can tell us whether they can see the slides clearly.
Yes, ma'am.
Wonderful. Okay. May I
Yes.
continue then? All right. So I'm going to begin with the investigation, the central narrative technique of all detective fiction. And for those of you who have read The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, you will understand why I have inserted an image of the dictaphone on the right of my slide. For those of you who haven't read The Murder of Roger Ackroyd yet, perhaps this image of the dictaphone will motivate you to do so. So crime and detective fiction, the golden age, specifically the age to which Agatha Christie and others belong. And then, as I mentioned, reading detective fiction. So I'm going to begin with a little bit of history, as I promised. And I have, for the moment, labeled it both crime and detective fiction, because the focus does tend to change as the genre evolves. The focus from the crime shifting to the detection, and in a lot of contemporary fiction, going back to a vivid, graphic, and sometimes gruesome description of the crime, with less energy being spent by the narrator on the detection of that crime. Okay, so I'd like to keep both words in my title for the moment. So the first, of course, is crime and detective fiction basically focuses on a crime that has been committed and its detection. Everybody knows that the crime has been committed. Who has committed it and why obviously become the reasons for the story that becomes the book that we hold in our hands, or the device that you hold in your hand if you're reading it on a screen. Murder, right? The killing of another human being remains interestingly at the heart of crime and detective fiction. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One reason, of course, could be biblical, because we do know that of the 10 commandments, the first commandment given to us by Moses, allegedly, is thou shalt not kill. But there are other more important reasons for murder having and continuing to have centrality in crime and detective fiction, or being, let's say, the preeminent crime. Um, it not only carries with it repugnance and fascination, because death, being the biggest mystery of all, has been a subject of eternal fascination in life as well as in literature, but it also carries with it an element of fear. And the one important thing about death is that it is not a crime for which any reparation can be made to the victim. I don't know if you followed that story recently. I think it was yesterday or day before in the newspaper about the woman who has been awarded a reparation of 2 crores by ITC Moria because she was given a bad haircut. So it was a crime, but reparation is possible. But murder is a crime for which no reparation is possible for the victim. Maybe for the family of the victim, but not for the victim himself or herself. Okay? The third thing about crime and detective fiction, very generally, is how both detective fiction as well as literary criticism are actually doing the same thing. They are actually decoding. What are they decoding? They are seeing how the there and then, what happened in the past, because the crime has already been committed when the investigation starts, right? How those can be understood in the here and the now. So the critic reading a literary or and a popular text, right, traces the cause and effect in the text, the devices, the context, the significance, the interaction of characters, etc., to make sense of it. The detective does something similar because the detective is trying to extrapolate, right, from available evidence back to the moment when the dagger was raised or the poison was administered or the gun was fired. Okay. Every individual work of crime fiction is built from devices, codes, and conventions that have already been established. And as I had said, this is my reason for believing that the history of this genre is important for us to at least glance at and maybe read in detail later. So when we are thinking about the earliest stories, okay, the beginnings of this genre, so we have a crime that is being committed. We have a punishment, a publicly executed, and I use that word deliberately, publicly executed punishment. And the purpose of that is to discourage others from committing a similar crime, lest they face a similar punishment. So crime then becomes any kind of transgression against the values and beliefs and faith that society has at the moment, and something that endangers the fabric of society. So crime at all costs has to be prevented if people have to continue to live together. Of course, gradually, what constitutes a crime becomes codified in law. One of the earliest crime fiction stories, of course, is the eternally delightful Oedipus Rex by Sophocles. One of the interesting tropes in Oedipus Rex, right, is the contamination caused by the crime. So when the murder has been committed, society is impacted by a literal plague that devastates that community. And the only way in which that pandemic of the plague can be mitigated, its effects can be mitigated, or it can be stopped, if the criminal is identified and expelled from society. Only then can society go back to being healthy again. That's one convention. Another convention, of course, we get from Seneca. Seneca, who gives us the 5-part model of the revenge tragedy, something that endures not only in Golden Age detective fiction, but way beyond that. Okay, very briefly, the 5 parts. First, the exposition. Okay, so all the events that lead to the investigation, let's say the murder and the discovery of that murder. The second, the anticipation, where the detective investigates the crime. The third would be the confrontation, where the criminal and the detective come face to face. It's not necessary that the detective has identified the criminal as yet, but the protagonist and the antagonist come face to face. Then there is partial execution, where the criminal seems to have got away with it, seems to have eluded detection. And then, of course, there is the completion, where the criminal is unmasked publicly, the detective correctly identifies the criminal, and then we have the denouement, where everything is sorted out. Coming to Agatha Christie, very briefly, a very, very favorite device by Hercule Poirot. At the end of, I will not say every, but most of the stories in which he appears, is to collect all the suspects together, share with them the modes of analysis that he used, and then literally and metaphorically unmask the criminal. Okay. If I continue with this history, so we had Sophocles and Oedipus Rex, we had Seneca, then we come to the grandfather of literary criticism, Western literary criticism. We have Aristotle, who in his Poetics not only gives us the structure of tragedy as he believed it should be, but also provides to us a very, very useful matrix by which we can analyze crime fiction. Unity of plot, cause and effect, peripeteia, ironic reversal, where suddenly things take a dramatic turn in the narrative, anagnosis, the discovery, and then, of course, the catharsis at the end, where the criminal has been apprehended and literally or metaphorically expelled from the society that the criminal was contaminating. Later crime fiction moves away from this revenge model, an eye for an eye kind of a model, and advocates and pays more attention to how social order needs to be restored and the machinery of justice has to be valorized, has to be given maximum importance, where crime, to put it in a very cliched way, where crime never pays. This is assisted by 2 or 3 historical milestones, okay? And these are important for us to know in the context of Golden Age detective fiction. In 1828, okay, the first official police force is established in England under Sir Robert Peel, and they are originally referred to as the Peelers for that reason. And then in 1842, this Metropolitan Police Force gets a detective department, okay, in order to investigate crimes. Another thing that comes to the aid or boosts the development and the popularity of detective fiction at the beginning of the 20th century is developments in science and technology. And remember, this is the Victorian age. This is the time when a great deal of is placed on science and rationality, right? Of course, science being put to the service of society and humanity is a paradigm that science fiction will later on contest. Okay, but that's for somebody else to talk about. 1839, photography is invented. 1888, we have the Bertillon system of physiognomical classification, classifying people based on their physiognomical features. This had a lot of, this led to a lot of problematic racial classification. But if I'm to leave that aside for a moment, it did help, right, in the investigation of crime. Skeletal and body movement measurements. It also helped to be able to identify a victim who may otherwise have been severely mutilated or disfigured as a result of the murder. In 1900, then, Galton Henry discovers the uniqueness of individual fingerprints. And we know that the fingerprint becomes a very, very valuable and, what shall I say, paradigmatic metonym for detective fiction. So when science enters the field of detection, okay, then the detective becomes a much more analytical and rational man. And I am using this gendered pronoun deliberately because we will realize that a lot of the detectives are actually male. In the Golden Age, a lot of the writers will be women, but the preeminent detectives of this period, with very few exceptions, remain men. Okay, hence my referring to him as a man. So this detective uses scientific data to infer and then to arrive at solutions. This element of logic, sometimes cold-blooded, almost inhuman logic, becomes a very, very formal and thematic trope in detective fiction for a very long time. So we have, for the beginning of the 20th century, then, for the person on the street, okay, for somebody like you and me, the three big saviors, okay, are the doctor, the scientist, and the policeman, who will, in their individual capacities, deal with anything that is disrupting my peace and security, and they will begin to work together. Okay. Then we have the persona of a narrator, the person who tells us the story. The famous Watson for Sherlock Holmes, and of course Hastings, who is the narrator for Hercule Poirot in many of the stories. This narrator acts as a foil to the detective, and a lot of detective fiction continues to have the persona of the narrator. This narrator also bridges the gap between the reader and the detective, okay, because the narrator is more like us than more like the detective. This narrator records the story, records the physical data used by the detective, and shares it with us, shares it with the reader. This narrator also represents the typical middle-class gentleman of that era. So the narrator does represent the social and ideological norms of the contemporary socio-cultural political environment in which the novel is set. The narrator will also help us, right? Help us as the reader by sharing with us the clues as they appear. And the narrator will tell us, the detective very often doesn't, but the narrator will tell us what he makes of these clues, how he interprets them, how he thinks that they play a role in piecing together the puzzle of the mystery. Okay, so there is an appearance of frankness, right? The only thing that is concealed, excuse me, from us is what is going on inside the detective's head. That we are not privy to, but everything that is visible, everything that is being analyzed, we are privy to that. Another thing that we will notice in Golden Age detective fiction is a Victorian legacy. The collection and classification of data into categories, into genres, into genus, if you like. The way time is ordered with clocks, with timetables, with maps, right? A lot of Agatha Christie books will have a lot of reference to these. Clocks play a very important role in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. So do maps, right? And this becomes the narrator's way of imposing some kind of order on the chaos that has resulted from the committing of the crime. 1868, Wilkie Collins' Moonstone, believed to be the first modern detective novel in English. Then we have, of course, and we cannot study detective fiction without him, we have Edgar Allan Poe, who creates the first fictional serial detective who will appear in 4 short stories, solve crimes, and he will use observation, rational analysis to solve the murder, Chevalier C. Auguste Deptt. And we also get from Poe 3 very, very important motifs of the detective novel, right? Motive number 1, the wrongly suspected man. All the evidence seems to point to him. Ralph Payton in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd would be the equivalent that you can think about. Then you have the hermetically sealed death chamber, the room that is locked from inside, right? And it is difficult for us to know how the criminal entered. More importantly, how did the criminal leave after committing the crime? And then we have a solution where the detective seems to use magic to solve the crime because everything falls into place, but magic has no role to play in Golden Age detective fiction. It is only pure intellectual analysis. Poe also enunciates 2 very popular aphorisms, which I have put in italics. When you have eliminated all the impossibles, then whatever remains, however improbable, must be true. And the second, equally intriguing one, the more complicated a case appears, the easier it will be to solve. And the simpler a case appears, the more difficult it is going to be to solve. 1887, Sherlock Holmes bursts onto the literary horizon in A Study in Scarlet, right? He's the archetype for the 20th century consulting detective, analytical, eccentric. A very important contribution to detective fiction is made by the Strand magazine, established in 1880, which publishes, right, regularly publishes detective stories, short stories, but gives the public, I beg your pardon, a taste for original, exciting, enjoyable puzzles, right? 1920-21, almost exactly a century ago, Agatha Christie will introduce Hercule Poirot, right, in The Mysterious Affair at Styles. And then, of course, the novel that we are concerned with, 1926, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd is published, and to use a contemporary idiom, it literally breaks the internet. So where are the rules coming from, right, when we are talking about the Golden Age? In 1930, right, this is 4 years after The Murder of Roger Ackroyd is published, a detection club is founded, okay? And one of the things that it does, like all clubs do, is it has a charter. And this charter is a decalogue, a 10-point program, if you like, or agenda, put in place by Father Ronald Knox, okay, who is one of the founding members. He had written this decalogue in 1929, and it gives the 10 rules that all writers who belong to this club must follow. Now, you can Google these rules, so I'm not going to spend too much time on them, but I am going to tell you one interesting thing which I'm not sure that you know. If you do, wonderful. If you don't, you might find it intriguing. The members of the detective club, right, collaborated and put together a murder mystery. They co-wrote a murder mystery. This was a fascinating experiment. So one person would write the first chapter, pass it on to the second person who would continue it. And then ultimately the denouement would be planned by somebody who was 10 times removed from the original person who started the story. Did they sit down and discuss the plot? No, they didn't, right? But does the story, and the book is called The Floating Admiral. You might want to look it up. It is available. It has been reprinted and is available. Does it hold together in terms of Aristotle's unity of plot and action? Yes, it does, in fact, rather fantastically. But it is a collaborative effort, right? Where 10 people, if I remember correctly, have got together to write it. Okay. So what kind of narrative strategies do detective novels typically use? 2 or 3 I thought I will share with you. The first one is what is referred to as retrograde analysis, where you reconstruct backwards to find out how things came to the present position. So the detective has the dead body in front of him. Hercule Poirot is looking at the dead body of Roger Ackroyd, and he needs to reconstruct the events of the past in order to arrive at the correct picture of who and how this happened, who committed the crime and how it was committed. Okay? So from the beginning, the denouement is prefigured. We do know that the denouement is going to involve answering 2 questions. Who done it? Okay. Who was the person who committed that crime? That's the primary question. And of course, the how and the why will feed into answering this primary. How done it and why done it. So there is a challenge that is thrown, almost like a gauntlet in medieval terms, that is thrown in front of the reader to compete with the detective, to use inductive logic, right, to move from effect to cause, to move backwards, and to see whether the reader can identify the criminal before the detective does. And you don't have a literal stopwatch here, but you do have the limits of the text. So before the exposure at the end, before the denouement, you have to be able to solve that crime. And I have to tell you that I have read, excuse me, every single of Agatha Christie's novels, 66 odd of them, featuring both Hercule Poirot and Jane Marple, and in some other detectives like Tommy and Tuppence, etc., in others, Mr. Quinn. I have never, very honestly, I have never been able to figure it out before the detective. Okay? So the second narrative strategy that I think is significant is that character is not as important as plot. The clue puzzle, the plot has primacy in detective novel. It's also a writerly text because the reader is not just a passive consumer, but actually attributes and produces meaning as the reader goes through the text. And when we are studying it, like you will be studying it or have begun studying it, we do tend to go to the text multiple times. And every time you go to it, you do create meaning again. The detective uses observation, interpretation of physical data, a very important context, if you like, or frame within which the Golden Age detective fiction has to be understood is the war, the Great War, the First World War, because it is the period between the 2 wars and immediately after the Second World War, right? That detective fiction actually reaches its golden heights, if you like. That's what this period is referred to. All the social and economic hardships, right, that the common person faced, or everybody faced, in fact, as a result of the devastation of the war and the economic depression that followed, all these are casually but significantly mentioned in Agatha Christie's and other Golden Age detective novels. A small example of that is how one of the primary motives for the crime is money. Okay, and since we do have straightened economic circumstances, money and the accompanying deadly sin of greed become very, very important motives in this fiction. Um, the setting very often is pastoral, it's an imaginary setting, but it's also an idealized harking back to a world before the war, right? And perhaps even before the devastation on the natural environment caused by the Industrial Revolution. So it's a very Edenic kind of surrounding. And because it is so Edenic, the criminal then becomes like the archetypical snake in the grass who has to be identified and expelled. So there is an illusion of the possibility of a return to a glorious past. Um, we also have that a possible reason why the detective novel becomes so popular at this time when England and Europe are devastated by the war could be because this is one of the last genres, final bastions, if you like, of the comedy of manners. Right? So we have a gentlemanly amateur detective, we have this almost magical restoration of harmony and peace in society. We also have the links to comedy because many of these detective novels have a quote unquote happy ending, right? Where separated lovers are reunited, where the innocent is saved from the death penalty or worse and is absolved of all guilt and public shame. And we also have these stock character types like you do in conventional as well as Shakespearean comedy, which appear, I think, retired military gentlemen and spinsters are the stock characters that Agatha Christie tells us that she has used in King's Abbot in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. Okay, so with the solution of the crime by the end of the novel, the reader feels more in control of the otherwise chaotic, alienating universe, where everything seems to be falling apart, at least for the period of that novel. Things seemed to be in control, and there seems to be a possibility that everything will fall into some kind of recognizable pattern. Okay. Um, it's also like a dance, as if you look at the second last bullet on this slide, um, Grella defines the detective novel as some kind of a dance, right? A beautifully um, choreographed dance, and a little reminder that at times of violence and rapid change, at times of threat to personal, physical, psychological, emotional, economic security, a certain literary form that has a lot of order and structure to it seems to become very popular. The sonnet and the detective novel, right? You can also think about the possibility that at the moment, okay, particularly in the last year and a half, because of all the horrors and chaos of the pandemic and the uncertainty and anxiety attendant upon it, one of the best selling genres at this time, online as well as in bookstores, is actually crime and detective fiction. So, what is detective fiction? Very quickly, two or three little important definitions that you might want to think about. One possible definition is a taxonomic one, where you differentiate it from other popular genres. A second possibility is where you have a major character who undertakes an investigation to solve a mystery, in this case, a murder. Uh, it also has as a defining element a question mark. So the puzzle element is very important. The idea of an intellectual game, a contest, a very safe contest between reader and detective within the time limit imposed by the length of the book. You also have a reenactment of a classical model where you have to get rid of, expel, expose, and then expel the person who seems to be causing all the trouble, the person who seems to be responsible for the troubles that you are facing. Okay, so you have a detective, you have an unsolved crime, an investigation, and the puzzle element. Just a couple more minutes. The formula is has almost become a cliche, and in spite of its cliched nature, the formula seems to work again and again and again. Not always equally successfully, but it does seem to work. Okay, a crime is committed. Nobody seems to be able to figure out how it was done, why it was done, and then by the end of it, you look back and say, "My God, all the clues, all the answers were staring at me in the face. I just did not notice them." And that, I think, becomes an eternal, enduring fascination with this genre. The Golden Age, 1920s and 30s specifically, okay, but a little beyond that, perhaps just after the Second World War as well. So you have intellectual game, you have the idea of fair play, right, where the reader must be given adequate chances to solve the crime. You have a finite space in which the investigation is carried out, and you have a finite number of suspects. Okay, so it becomes a little easier. The variables in the game are limited. Historical factors I've already talked about, which led to the development and the fluorescence of this genre. Okay, clues, real clues, false clues, which we refer to as red herrings. Remember that the corpse can't speak. Okay, because the corpse can't speak, the corpse has to become then more than just a person, has to become a symbol or a metonym, and everything has to be constructed around the existence of that corpse. His or her biography, so we can say his if we're talking about the murder of Roger Ackroyd, relationships, and, as I've put in the second point, the triangulation of motive, opportunity, and means. Who is the person who had the means, the opportunity, and the motive to be able to construct that crime, to be able to commit that crime? Three little important words that you might want to think about. So there is, and these figure very prominently in the murder of Roger Ackroyd, you have analepsis. We will have continuous reconstructions, right, of the events that took place. Every time a reconstruction will build on a previous one. You have prolepsis, right? Had I but known, had these facts been known to me in advance, then I could have arrived at the solution. And then you have, of course, the mood, the point of view, etc. You have the readers, which I've already talked about, happy ending. Look at 1, 2, 3. Point number 3, the point I made about entertainment, a little quotation which I really like from the murder of Roger Ackroyd. It pleases me very much to think of her stepping out of the housekeeper's room to rebuke a delinquent housemaid and then returning to a comfortable perusal of the mystery of the seventh death or something of the kind. The accessibility and popularity of the genre. And this is the point with which I'd like to end, the unambiguous moral basis of detective fiction. To quote Hercule Poirot himself, I have a bourgeois attitude to murder. I disapprove of it. I'm going to take you to this. Okay. On the 27th of July, Jamie Fisher writes this in the New York Times. Okay, and she talks about the mystery of her obsession with Agatha Christie. Please read it. I will read it out to you as well. I think you will find that it will resonate with you. It might seem perverse to have escaped into murder mysteries when people were dying suddenly all around me. But Christie offered deaths that were orderly and manageable. The character who got me through the pandemic was Hercule Poirot, that mustachioed and gloriously petty rationalist, finding clues in every hint of disorder. Agatha Christie was a refuge of definitive resolution. It is probably coincidental that Poirot was first introduced in 1920, on the tail of the great influenza pandemic. Christie wrote The Mysterious Affair at Styles 4 years earlier, while nursing soldiers in Devon. But Poirot is the patron saint for the world of soul-numbing procedural care we found ourselves in last year, and might find ourselves in the foreseeable future. His catchwords are order and method. The more time I spent with him, the more our pandemic routines started to seem less like boring compulsions and more like apprentice detective work. If I was fussing over hand washing procedures or eyeing every slightly crooked mask with suspicion, maybe I was just a Poirot in the making. I wanted to roll my eyes at Poirot, but I also found myself turning to him as a spiritual teacher. In writing Quiet Domestic Murders, Christie warned us that our quiet domesticity can be interrupted at any time. But she also held out hope that it might return in the epilogue. Thank you.
Sorry, my mic was off.
Sorry, I went a little over time, but I hope that's okay.
Thank you, ma'am. It was really wonderful. And for someone like me who is not much into detective fiction, not as a teacher at least, for me it was really, a source of knowledge. So if you have any query, you can post your questions in the chat box, and Anjana ma'am can, answer them. Students, teachers, anyone, if you want to ask anything, if you're teaching this paper, or even otherwise you may have a general query regarding this genre, you can put up your question in the chat box. Meera ma'am, are you raising your hand? Meera ma'am wants to
No,
ask something.
no, I don't want to ask anything. I just want to compliment Dr. Anjana for her excellent talk because, it encapsulated so many little things that, we, as just a reader of detective novels, one may not have focused on. But there's the method behind the fiction was so well brought out and very well informed. So I've thoroughly enjoyed listening to you.
Thank you so much. I
Thank you
appreciate
so
that.
much.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Meera ma'am. Nidhi Angurala wants to ask something. She's a colleague.
Hello.
Yes, Nidhi.
I actually have a comment rather than a question.
Go ahead,
I'm
please.
sorry. I'm sorry to be that annoying person who chimes in with a comment rather than a question. But I think you mentioned how there's a similarity between the act of reading critically and detective fiction as well. And I think we see the convergence of that in this one particular novel, which interestingly falls into the category, the very nebulous category of literary fiction, as Swati pointed out. It's A's by its possession. If you may have heard of
I
it,
have.
yes.
I've read
So
it too. Yeah.
yes, so that's what it reminded me of, that because the novel is a literary mystery, but and it sort of combines the act of reading itself, of excavating the past through the present, and
Absolutely.
just that small comment.
It's a lovely comment. Most welcome.
All right, thank you.
We have a student here. His name is not mentioned there, and because by virtue of the patriarchal language, I mentioned he. I shouldn't have. So the question is that he wants to know, how do we address the questions from an exam perspective?
So that's a difficult question. Let me begin by saying that, and if with Swati's permission, rather than answering that question, if I have a minute, Swati, I had prepared a little bibliography, if I can share that.
Sure, ma'am.
And
Sure, ma'am. Please
you all
go ahead.
can take a screenshot of it, and then I think that will solve what you wanted. Yeah. Give me half a second. I'm just going to pull it up. There you go.
So the students can take note. You can
take a screenshot of this. I think any possible reference that you need for The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, and to really, really enhance your enjoyment of reading detective fiction, these are my top suggestions. Okay, I hope that answered the question.
Thank you, ma'am.
Especially the last one.
Anyone else? Any queries, comments? We can take a comment as well.
Yeah, all comments are welcome. Criticism, comments, definitely welcome.
Then I think we can move on to our next speaker.
Yes.
And I'm very sorry that I forgot to introduce ma'am, which is a formality for any program, but I think she needs no introduction, so I think I can be excused for that.
Let my talk be my introduction.
And most of us, if you in first year, you must have the books we have, AECC books, academic writing, creative writing, you name it. Most of the there are many books that you have in the first year that have been written by ma'am, so she needs no introduction. For Sakshi, she is person